The morning sun sliced through the windshield as Derek checked his watch for the third time. 12 minutes. 12 minutes until the interview that could finally pull him and his son out of the shadows of poverty. His worn dress shirt, ironed 6 times the night before, still carried faint wrinkles he couldn't afford to fix. Then the highway curved, and he saw her. A woman in a tailored charcoal blazer, expensive heels sinking into gravel, standing frozen beside a car, bleeding smoke into the pale sky. Their eyes met through his dusty window. Hers held something he recognized, the quiet terror of being stranded, alone, invisible. His foot found the brake before his mind could argue. The engine fell silent. Derek stepped out, leaving his future idling on that empty road. He didn't know her name. Didn't know she owned the building he was racing toward. Didn't know that this single act of kindness would cost him everything and give him back even more. Some doors only open when we stop chasing them. The apartment was small, the walls thin enough to hear the neighbor's television murmuring through them like a distant conversation. Derek Hayes stood before the bathroom mirror, his calloused fingers struggling with the knot of a tie he hadn't worn in 3 years. The fabric was slightly faded at the edges, a relic from another life when he wore suits daily and walked through glass doors that recognized his name. Now those doors had closed, and he found himself in this 2-bedroom apartment where the heating worked only when it wanted to, and the rent was always due before his paycheck arrived. But today was different. Today carried the weight of possibility, and Derek could feel it pressing against his chest like a second heartbeat. Behind him, 9-year-old Colton sat on the edge of the bathtub, watching his father with those serious eyes that had grown up too fast. The boy held a bowl of cereal in his lap, eating slowly, as if he understood that this morning required reverence. His backpack was already packed, sitting by the door, like a patient dog waiting for its walk. Father and son had developed their routines in the 3 years since Colton's mother passed, silent rituals that spoke louder than words. Derek glanced at his son through the mirror's reflection and managed a smile that felt heavier than it looked. "You nervous, Dad?" Colton asked, his spoon pausing midair. The question was simple, but it carried the accumulated weight of watching his father work 3 jobs, come home exhausted, and still find energy to help with homework before collapsing into sleep. Derek turned around, crouching down to meet his son's eyes at the same level. The bathroom tiles were cold against his knee, a small discomfort he'd learned to ignore, along with so many others. He reached out and ruffled Colton's hair, still damp from his morning shower. "A little," Derek admitted, because he'd promised himself long ago never to lie to his son. But the good kind of nervous, the kind that means something important is about to happen. Colton nodded slowly, processing this information with the gravity of a child who had learned that life didn't always deliver on its promises. He set his cereal bowl aside and stood up, wrapping his thin arms around his father's neck in a hug that smelled of soap and childhood innocence. Derek held him tight, drawing strength from this small body that depended on him for everything. "You're gonna get the job," Colton said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "You're the smartest person I know." Derek laughed softly, the sound catching in his throat. If only the world worked on the logic of 9-year-olds, where being smart and working hard guaranteed success. The reality was messier, filled with gaps in resumes and questions about why a talented architect had spent 3 years working at hardware stores and doing night shifts at warehouses. But he couldn't explain that to Colton, not yet. Instead, he kissed his son's forehead and stood up, adjusting his tie one final time. "Come on, buddy, Mrs. Henderson is waiting." Their elderly neighbor had agreed to watch Colton until school started, one of the many small kindnesses that held their fragile life together. As they walked through the living room, Derek's eyes fell on the framed photograph on the bookshelf, his wife Carolyn, frozen in a moment of laughter, her eyes crinkled at the corners. He didn't stop, didn't linger, but his hand brushed against the frame as he passed. A silent promise, a reminder of why he kept fighting when surrender seemed so much easier. The highway stretched before him like a gray ribbon unspooling toward destiny. Derek's old sedan hummed along, its engine making sounds that required faith to ignore. The radio played softly, some country song about redemption and second chances that felt almost too on the nose. He drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, mentally rehearsing answers to questions he'd researched for weeks. Patterson Architecture was one of the most prestigious firms in the state, and they were looking for a senior project coordinator. The position was below what he'd once held, but it was a door back into the world he'd been forced to leave. 3 years ago, Derek had been a rising star at Morrison & Associates, designing buildings that would outlast him by centuries. Then Carolyn got sick, and the world that had seemed so solid began to crumble at the edges. The treatments were expensive, the insurance inadequate, and somewhere between hospital visits and sleepless nights, Derek made the only choice that made sense. He quit his job to take care of his wife and son, burning through their savings. Then their retirement fund, then everything else. When Carolyn finally lost her battle, she left behind a husband drowning in medical debt and a little boy who needed his father more than ever. The exit for Patterson Architecture was 7 miles away when Derek saw the smoke. It rose in thin wisps at first, almost invisible against the pale morning sky, then thickened into something more ominous. His foot eased off the accelerator as the scene came into focus. A silver luxury sedan pulled onto the shoulder, its hood propped open like a gaping mouth, smoke pouring from its mechanical heart. And beside it, a woman. She stood with her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing with the controlled frustration of someone used to problems solving themselves. But out here, on this empty stretch of highway, there was no one to delegate to. Derek's grip tightened on the steering wheel. 12 minutes. He had exactly 12 minutes to make his interview, and this stretch of highway was notorious for its lack of cell service. The woman was clearly wealthy. Her car alone was worth more than his annual income, and surely someone would stop for her soon. Someone with more time. Someone whose entire future didn't hang on a single appointment. His foot pressed harder on the gas, and the sedan began to pull ahead, leaving the stranded woman in his rearview mirror. Then he saw her face. Really saw it. The phone had dropped from her ear, and she was staring at her car with an expression that transcended class and circumstance. It was the look of someone who had reached the end of their expertise, standing at the edge of a problem they couldn't buy or delegate their way out of. Derek knew that look. He'd worn it himself when the doctor spoke in gentle tones about treatment options and realistic expectations. His foot found the brake almost before his mind made the decision. The car slowed, pulled onto the shoulder, and stopped about 30 feet behind her vehicle. For a moment, Derek sat in the idling car, his hand still on the wheel. The dashboard clock ticked away the seconds of his interview. He thought of Colton's face that morning, full of faith in a father who always did the right thing. He thought of Carolyn, who had spent her life believing that kindness was never wasted, even when the world seemed determined to prove otherwise. And he thought of himself. The man he'd been before grief and poverty had worn away everything but the essential core. That man would have stopped without hesitation. That man still existed somewhere inside him, waiting for permission to act. Derek turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The woman turned at the sound of his door closing, her expression cycling through surprise, wariness, and finally a guarded relief. Up close, Derek could see the details that wealth couldn't protect. The smudge of oil on her designer blazer, the frustrated tears she was fighting to contain, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of adrenaline and helplessness. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps early 30s, with sharp features softened by the vulnerability of her current situation. Her phone hung limply at her side, its screen displaying the mocking absence of signal bars. "Car trouble?" Derek asked, and immediately felt foolish. Of course it was car trouble. The smoke still curled from beneath the hood like incense at a funeral, but the woman's shoulders relaxed slightly at the mundane question, as if the simple acknowledgement of her problem made it more manageable. She nodded, gesturing toward the smoking engine with the resignation of someone who had already cycled through anger and arrived at acceptance. "I have no idea what happened," she said, her voice carrying the careful enunciation of someone used to being listened to. "One minute I'm driving. The next, there's smoke everywhere. My phone has no signal, and I've been standing here for 20 minutes watching cars drive past." There was accusation in that last sentence, subtle but present, and Derek felt it land. He'd almost been one of those cars. The thought sat uncomfortably in his chest as he walked toward her vehicle. Rolling up his sleeves. "Let me take a look." The engine was a mess of overheated components and leaking fluids. Derek leaned in, his years of working with his hands during his fall from grace suddenly proving useful. He'd learned to fix things when he couldn't afford to pay others to do it. Cars, appliances, the broken pieces of a life that didn't come with warranties. The radiator hose had split, spraying coolant across the engine block and causing the dramatic smoke show. Not catastrophic, but not a roadside fix either. "Your radiator hose is shot," Derek said, straightening up and wiping his hands on a rag he'd grabbed from his trunk. "The good news is it's not dangerous. The bad news is you're not driving this anywhere until it's fixed." The woman closed her eyes for a moment, processing this information. When she opened them, there was a new hardness there, the armor of someone recalibrating their expectations. She looked at her phone again, as if willing bars to appear through sheer determination. "I have a meeting," she said, half to herself. "An important one." Derek almost laughed at the bitter symmetry. Here they were, two strangers with important meetings, stranded together on a highway that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and obligation. He checked his own phone, still no signal. The interview was now 8 minutes away, and he was at least 15 minutes from the Patterson Architecture Building under ideal conditions. The math was simple and brutal. "There's a gas station about 3 miles back," Derek said, making a decision that felt both devastating and inevitable. "I can drive you there, and you can call for a tow." The woman looked at him with new interest, really seeing him for the first time. Her eyes took in his worn dress shirt, his second-hand tie, the anxiety that probably showed on his face, despite his best efforts to hide it. Something in her expression shifted, recognition perhaps of a kindness that cost more than it appeared. "You're dressed for something important yourself," she observed. It wasn't a question, but Derek nodded anyway. "Job interview. Pretty crucial one, actually." He didn't elaborate on how crucial, didn't mention that this interview represented his last realistic chance to return to his career before another gap in his resume made the journey impossible. Some things were too heavy to lay on strangers. The woman's expression flickered with something that might have been guilt. "You should go," she said, the words clearly costing her. "I'll figure something out." Derek looked at her, really looked, and saw the fear beneath the composed surface. She was alone on an empty highway, phone useless, in a car that had betrayed her, watching her one chance at help preparing to drive away. He thought about all the times he'd felt abandoned during Carolyn's illness, when friends and colleagues had gradually stopped calling, when the isolation had felt like its own kind of death. Then he thought about his son and the simple code they lived by. "Get in," Derek said, nodding toward his car. "My interview can wait." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but some truths were too harsh for strangers. The woman hesitated for only a moment before grabbing her purse from the front seat and following him to his sedan. As she settled into the passenger seat, her expensive perfume mingling with the scent of coffee and the faint musk of hard work, Derek realized he didn't even know her name. "I'm Derek," he offered, starting the engine. "Derek Hayes." The woman looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Brooke," she said simply. "Thank you, Derek. Truly." The drive to the gas station took longer than expected. Road construction, a slow truck, all the small obstacles that accumulate into disaster. By the time Derek pulled into the station and Brooke found a working phone to call for help, his interview had started without him. When he finally arrived at Patterson Architecture 43 minutes late, the receptionist's sympathetic smile told him everything he needed to know. Still, he asked to speak with someone, explained about the car accident, the stranded woman, the dead zone on the highway. The HR director, a thin man named Harold Webb, with eyes like calculation, emerged from his office with the practiced patience of someone who had heard every excuse. His expression didn't change as Derek spoke, but his dismissal was absolute. "We had 47 applicants for this position, Mr. Hayes," Harold said, his voice carrying the artificial warmth of corporate rejection. 23 showed up on time. 6 were exceptional. I'm afraid punctuality is non-negotiable for a company of our standards. Derek wanted to argue, wanted to explain that punctuality had been his religion for 20 years before life taught him that some things mattered more than schedules. But he recognized the futility in Harold's polished smile. The door already closed behind eyes that had never known real hardship. The drive home felt longer than the morning commute. Derek stopped at a red light and watched people crossing the street. Employed people, people whose futures weren't imploding in slow motion. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Henderson. "Colton got to school fine. Hope your interview went well." The hope in that message felt like a weight. That night, after Colton was in bed, Derek sat alone in the dark living room, Carolyn's photograph catching the streetlight through the window. He'd done the right thing. He knew that. But the right thing had cost him everything. The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors in rain. Derek picked up extra shifts at the warehouse, applied for jobs that required less qualification, less history, less of the man he used to be. Each rejection was a small death, a reminder that the world didn't reward kindness the way fairy tales promised. He kept the worst from Colton, maintaining their routines, their rituals, the fiction that everything was fine. But children see more than adults give them credit for, and sometimes Derek caught his son watching him with worried eyes. It was a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the interview, when Derek stopped at a small coffee shop to fill out yet another application. The place was modest, mismatched furniture, local art on the walls, the kind of establishment that survived on character rather than marketing. He ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and found a corner table, spreading his worn resume across the surface like a patience chart. The words seemed to mock him. Bachelor of Architecture, Master of Urban Design, 10 years of experience that meant nothing now. "Derek?" The voice came from behind him, familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. He turned and found himself face to face with Brooke, the woman from the highway, now dressed in casual elegance rather than corporate armor. She looked different in this context, softer somehow, though her eyes held the same sharp intelligence. Recognition dawned on her face, followed by something more complex. She was holding a coffee and a laptop, clearly planning to work, but she set both down on his table without asking permission. "I looked for you," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "After that day, I wanted to thank you properly, but I realized I didn't even know your last name until you said it." Hayes, that's not common enough to search easily. Derek wasn't sure how to respond. The universe's timing seemed cruel, putting this woman back in his path now, when the consequences of helping her had fully materialized. He managed a tired smile. "How did the tow go?" he asked, deflecting from his own situation. Brooke waved away the question with the casual gesture of someone for whom car repairs were minor inconveniences. "Fine, but I want to know about you. Your interview. Did you make it?" The question hung between them, and Derek found he couldn't lie. There had been enough pretending, enough exhausting performance of okayness. He shook his head slowly. They wouldn't see me, he admitted. HR director said punctuality was non-negotiable. He tried to say it lightly, as if it were just one of those things. But Brooke's expression hardened in a way that surprised him. She leaned forward, her coffee forgotten, her eyes searching his face. "Patterson Architecture," she said. It wasn't a question. Derek's confusion must have shown on his face, because she continued before he could respond. "I saw you drive away that day, after you dropped me off. I noted your license plate, meant to send flowers or something to say thank you. Then I got caught up in—" She trailed off, something complicated moving behind her eyes. "Tell me about yourself, Derek Hayes. Tell me everything." There was something in her voice that made Derek comply. Over cooling coffee, he told her the abbreviated version of his life. The promising career, the sick wife, the choice to prioritize family over ambition. He told her about the medical bills that had consumed everything, the 3 years of survival jobs, the slow erosion of his professional identity. He told her about Colton, about the promise he'd made to Carolyn to give their son a better life, about the daily failure to fulfill that promise. When he finished, Brooke was silent for a long moment. "You were an architect," she said finally. "A good one, based on what you've told me. And you gave that up to take care of your wife." Derek nodded, unsure where this was going. Brooke pulled her laptop toward her and began typing rapidly. "Send me your resume," she said, reciting an email address. "Send it today." Derek started to protest, to explain that he'd already applied everywhere, that his resume was a liability rather than an asset. But something in her eyes stopped him. "Who are you?" he asked, the question he should have started with. Brooke smiled for the first time, and it transformed her face from beautiful to something more. "Human." "Brooke Patterson," she said. "I own the company you tried to interview at, and I think it's time we had a proper conversation about your future." The Patterson Architecture headquarters looked different from the inside. When Derek had arrived for his failed interview, he'd only seen the lobby, all glass and steel and the desperate hope of the unemployed. Now, walking through the executive floor beside Brooke, he saw the building for what it was, a monument to the kind of work he'd once dreamed of doing. Architectural models sat in glass cases along the hallways, each one representing a project that would outlast the people who created it. Derek recognized some of the designs from industry publications, from the years when he'd still been part of this world. Brooke led him to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The view was spectacular, steel and glass stretching toward the horizon, a testament to human ambition made solid. She gestured for him to sit, then took the chair across from him rather than the head of the table. It was a small thing, but Derek noticed. Everything about this woman was deliberate. "I pulled your file," Brooke said, sliding a folder across the table. "The one HR put together when you applied. Do you know what Harold wrote about you?" Derek shook his head, though he could imagine. 3-year gap, overqualified, probably desperate. Brooke opened the folder and read aloud. Candidate showed poor judgment in time management. "Do not recommend." She closed the folder with more force than necessary. "Poor judgment, because you stopped to help a stranger?" "To be fair, punctuality matters in this industry," Derek said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Brooke fixed him with a look that made him feel like she was seeing past his careful facade to the exhausted man underneath. "I've been in this business for 12 years, she said. "I took over from my father 8 years ago, and I've learned one thing that Harvard Business School never taught me. Character matters more than credentials. I can train someone to be on time. I can't train them to be good." She pulled out another folder, this one thicker. "I looked into your background more thoroughly. Morrison and Associates. They spoke highly of you. Said you were one of the most talented designers they'd ever had, and they were devastated when you left. Derek felt something shift in his chest, a door he'd thought permanently closed, creaking open. They had to fill my position, he said. I don't blame them. Brooke nodded, acknowledging the complexity of professional survival. They also mentioned your wife, said the whole office sent flowers to her funeral. The words landed softly, but they still landed. Derek looked out the window, giving himself a moment to compose his face. I'm not offering you a job out of pity, Brooke continued, her voice firm. I'm offering you an opportunity because I think you're exactly what this company needs. We're bidding on the Riverside Community Center project, the biggest public works contract in the city's history. The design committee specifically requested someone who understands community, who has roots in something beyond profit margins. Your portfolio, your experience, your story. You're perfect for this. Derek turned back to face her, the words registering slowly. You want me to design the Riverside project? The question sounded absurd even to his own ears. 3 weeks ago, he'd been stocking shelves at a hardware store. Now the CEO of one of the most prestigious architectural firms in the state was offering him the project of a lifetime. The dissonance was dizzying. I want you to lead it, Brooke clarified. Full creative control, with support from our senior team. This is a chance to show everyone, including yourself, what you're still capable of. She paused, something vulnerable flickering across her professional composure. That day on the highway, you gave me something I didn't know I needed. Not just help with the car. You reminded me that some people still do the right thing, even when it costs them. That's rare, Derek. Rarer than talent. For a long moment, Derek didn't speak. The offer was everything he'd dreamed of, wrapped in a package he didn't feel he deserved. The old voices whispered in his ear, the ones that had grown loud during 3 years of rejection, telling him he was damaged goods, that the gap in his resume was an unbridgeable chasm. Then he thought of Colton, of the promise he'd made to Carolyn, of the man he used to be and still wanted to become. I can't accept this, he said, the words tasting like ash. Brooke's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. Why not? Derek stood up, moving to the window where the city spread out below, like a map of possibilities he'd stopped believing in. Because you feel obligated. Because I helped you once, and you're paying it back. I don't want charity, Miss Patterson. I want to earn my place. Brooke stood as well, joining him at the window. Her reflection overlapped with the city below, creating a ghostly double image. Do you think I built this company on sentiment? She asked, her voice hardening slightly. My father handed me a failing business and a board of directors who thought a woman couldn't lead. I've fought for every contract, every client, every ounce of respect this company has earned. I don't do charity, Derek. I do investments. And you're a good investment. She turned to face him directly, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. But if you need to earn it, then earn it. Take the project. Pour everything you have into it. Let the work speak for itself. If you fail on your own merits. But if you succeed, and I believe you will, no one can ever say you didn't deserve it. The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and something in Derek responded to it. This was a chance, maybe his last one. Could he really afford to walk away from it because of pride? The board will have questions, he said slowly, his resistance weakening. The HR director already has opinions about me. Brooke smiled, and there was steel in it. Harold Webb can keep his opinions to himself. This is my company, and I decide who works here. But you're right. There will be scrutiny. Are you ready for that? Derek thought about all the scrutiny he'd already faced, from debt collectors, from potential employers, from the mirror every morning. What was a little more? I'm ready, he said, and for the first time in 3 years, he believed it. The whispers started on Derek's first day. They followed him through the halls like persistent ghosts, floating from cubicle to cubicle, in the way office gossip always does. He caught fragments, CEO's new favorite, hired off the street, probably something going on there, and learned to let them slide past without sticking. He had work to do, and work had always been his best defense against a world that seemed determined to doubt him. Harold Webb was less subtle about his disapproval. The HR director found reasons to appear in Derek's office doorway, his thin smile carrying the patience of someone waiting for inevitable failure. "Settling in all right?" he would ask, the question laced with subtext. "Let me know if the workload becomes too much. After such a long break from the industry, it must be overwhelming." Derek responded with professionalism and results, the only languages that mattered. The Riverside Community Center project consumed him in the best possible way. He arrived early and stayed late, spreading blueprints across his desk like sacred texts, redesigning and refining until the building existed in his mind, as vividly as if it had already been built. The center was meant to serve the underserved, after-school programs, job training, community gatherings, and Derek poured his own experiences into every line. He knew what it meant to need help and find it. He knew what it meant to need help and find nothing but closed doors. 2 weeks into the project, Harold called an emergency board meeting. Derek wasn't invited, but Brooke told him about it afterward, her jaw tight with barely contained anger. "He presented concerns about the hiring process," she said, her voice clipped. "Suggested that my judgment was compromised, that personal feelings had influenced a professional decision." The implication was clear, and Derek felt his stomach drop. He'd been so focused on the work that he'd forgotten how easily work could be undermined by politics. "What did you tell them?" Derek asked, dreading the answer. Brooke's expression softened slightly. "I told them to wait, to judge you by your work, not by rumors. The design presentation is in 3 weeks. If it's good enough, it won't matter how you got here. If it's not..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Derek understood the stakes clearly. His job, his reputation, and now Brooke's credibility were all riding on blueprints and dreams. That night, Derek stayed at the office until midnight, refining his designs. When he finally drove home, exhausted but determined, Colton was asleep and Mrs. Henderson was dozing on the couch. He carried his son to bed, tucking the blanket around him with the gentleness of a man who understood how fragile precious things could be. Tomorrow, he would work harder. Tomorrow, he would prove that kindness and competence weren't mutually exclusive. Tonight, he would allow himself this small moment of peace. The presentation took place on a rainy Tuesday morning. Derek stood before the Patterson Architecture Board of Directors, 7 people whose names represented decades of industry influence, with his designs projected on the wall behind him. Harold Webb sat in the corner, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes hungry for failure. Brooke occupied the head of the table, her face professionally blank, offering no support or criticism that could be construed as favoritism. Derek talked for 45 minutes. He explained how the building's design maximized natural light to reduce energy costs while creating welcoming spaces. He detailed the flexible floor plans that could accommodate everything from children's art classes to community town halls. He showed how the exterior would complement the surrounding neighborhood while still standing as a beacon of possibility. But mostly, he talked about people, the families who would gather there, the children who would learn there, the community that would grow stronger because this building existed. When he finished, the silence stretched like a held breath. Then the oldest board member, a woman named Patricia Keller, who had been designing buildings since before Derek was born, leaned forward. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of excellence, "I've seen hundreds of project proposals in my career. This is one of the best." The words hung in the air, and Derek watched as the rest of the board nodded in agreement. Even Harold's mask slipped for a moment, revealing something like disappointment. The vote was unanimous. Patterson Architecture would submit Derek's design for the Riverside Community Center, with him as the lead architect. As the board members gathered their things and offered congratulations, Brooke caught Derek's eye across the room. Her smile was small but genuine, carrying satisfaction and something else, perhaps the vindication of a risk that had paid off. Harold slipped out without a word, his objections overruled by results. The weeks that followed were a blur of refinement and collaboration. Derek worked with engineers, contractors, and city planners to bring his vision into buildable reality. He attended community meetings where residents shared their hopes for the center, and he incorporated their feedback into the design. For the first time in years, he felt like himself again, not the grieving widower, not the struggling single father, but the architect who had once believed that buildings could change lives. Colton noticed the change. "You're happier, Dad," he observed one evening over dinner, his young face serious with observation. "You smile more now." Derek reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "I found something I love to do again," he said. "Something I'm good at. It makes a difference." Colton nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That's what Mom used to say about nursing," he said, "that helping people made everything else easier." The mention of Carolyn didn't hurt the way it used to. Instead, it felt like a blessing. The city awarded the Riverside contract on a Friday afternoon in October. Derek was in his office when the call came, surrounded by blueprints and coffee cups and the debris of dedicated work. Brooke delivered the news personally, appearing in his doorway with a smile that transformed her professional reserve into something almost girlish with joy. "We won," she said simply, and those two words contained multitudes. The Patterson Architecture Annual Gala was held in December, a glittering affair that celebrated the year's achievements and the people who made them possible. Derek stood near the edge of the ballroom, uncomfortable in a tuxedo that actually fit, a far cry from the borrowed suit he'd worn to his failed interview months ago. Colton was at home with Mrs. Henderson, though Derek had promised to bring him a piece of the fancy cake that the caterers were distributing. The room was full of architects, clients, and city officials, all dressed in their finest and speaking in the elevated tones of professional celebration. Derek had shaken more hands in the past hour than in the previous 3 years combined. Everyone wanted to meet the man behind the Riverside design, the project that had already generated more positive press than any Patterson initiative in recent memory. Patricia Keller had called it a masterwork of community-centered design, and the quote had appeared in 3 different industry publications. When Brooke took the stage to address the gathered crowd, the room fell silent with the respect she had earned through years of leadership. She spoke about the company's achievements, the projects completed, the challenges overcome. Then she paused, her eyes finding Derek across the sea of faces. "I want to tell you about something that happened last spring," she said, her voice carrying easily through the silent room. "I was stranded on the highway with a broken car and no cell service. I watched car after car drive past without stopping, and then one stopped." She smiled slightly, a personal memory surfacing through the professional performance. "The man who helped me was on his way to an interview, a very important interview here at Patterson. By the time he got me to safety, he'd missed his chance. Our HR department turned him away." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Derek felt heat rise to his face as hundreds of eyes searched for the subject of the story. Brooke continued, her voice steady. "When I found out what had happened, I made a decision that some people questioned. I hired him anyway. Not because he helped me, but because someone who puts kindness above self-interest is exactly the kind of person I want representing this company. Tonight, I'd like to honor that person and the work that has proven my decision right." She raised her champagne glass. "To Derek Hayes, lead architect of the Riverside Community Center, and this year's recipient of the Patterson Excellence Award. Derek, please join me on stage." The applause started somewhere in the back, and built into a wave that carried Derek forward. He walked through the crowd, on legs that felt disconnected from his body, climbing the steps to the stage where Brooke waited with a small crystal trophy. Up close, he could see that her eyes were bright with something that looked like pride, and something else he wasn't quite ready to name. "You earned this," she whispered, as she handed him the award, soft enough that only he could hear. "Every bit of it." Derek took the trophy, feeling its weight in his palm, heavier than expected, like the significance it represented. He turned to face the crowd, searching for words equal to the moment. 3 years ago, he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought my career was over. I thought I'd never design anything again. But I learned something in those years of struggle that I couldn't have learned any other way. Buildings are important, but people are everything. The Riverside Community Center isn't just concrete and glass. It's a promise that every person who walks through its doors matters. That help exists when you need it. That kindness is never wasted." He looked at Brooke, standing beside him with that small smile that had become familiar over months of collaboration. "I've been given a second chance I didn't expect and probably don't deserve. I intend to spend the rest of my career trying to be worthy of it." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, washing over Derek like a wave returning him to shore after years lost at sea. He stepped down from the stage as the gala resumed its flow of conversation and celebration. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the caterers were beginning to clear the tables, Derek found himself on the terrace overlooking the city. The winter air was cold but clean, carrying the promise of snow. Brooke appeared beside him, 2 cups of coffee in her hands, an echo of their first real conversation in that small coffee shop. "Quite a night," she said, handing him one of the cups. Their fingers brushed in the transfer, and neither of them pulled away immediately. "Quite a year," Derek agreed. He thought about where he'd been 12 months ago, drowning in debt, working jobs that paid but didn't fulfill, watching his son grow up in the shadow of loss. Now he stood on a terrace that overlooked the city he would help shape, beside a woman who had given him a chance when he'd given up on chances. "What happens now?" Brooke asked, the question carrying layers she didn't specify. Derek looked at her, really looked, and saw not just the CEO who had changed his life, but the woman behind the title. A woman who had her own struggles, her own loneliness, her own need for connection that wealth couldn't buy. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'd like to find out." Brooke's smile widened, and this time it reached her eyes completely. "Colton would probably like that restaurant on 5th Street, she said, the non sequitur landing with perfect clarity. "The one with the arcade games in the back. We could take him this weekend." Derek felt something bloom in his chest. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of something he hadn't dared to imagine. "He'd love that," Derek said, "and so would I." They stood together in the cold December air, looking out at a city full of buildings and the people who filled them. Somewhere out there, the Riverside Community Center would soon begin construction, a place where help would be given and received, where kindness would multiply in ways no one could predict. And standing beside Derek, close enough to share warmth against the winter chill, was proof that sometimes the detours we take lead us exactly where we're meant to be. Some doors only open when we stop chasing them. Derek had stopped chasing that morning on the highway, and look what had opened instead. A career reborn, a purpose renewed, and now perhaps a heart ready to love again. As the first snowflakes began to fall, catching the city lights like tiny promises, he reached over and took Brooke's hand. She didn't pull away. In the language of winter mornings and second chances, that was enough. More than enough. It was a beginning. And sometimes, that's all we really need.